And welcome back to Consumer Choice Radio. We're here with our colleagues here at the Consumer Choice Center. We wanted to get them on to get a different perspective. You're probably tired of David and I talking about hashtag election 2020. But we wanted to get our colleagues. So we have Managing Director Fred Roeder. We have Bill Wirtz, who's our Senior Policy Analyst over there in Europe. And then we have Fabio Fernandes, our Media Associate. David as well on the line. So guys, let's just go quick. Who wants to give a first take here?
Well,
David?
Yeah, actually, I'm going to interrupt you because before we get into this, just for our listeners' sake, I want to highlight how truly international this group of fine gentlemen is. So Fred is German, based in London. Bill is from Luxembourg, which is actually a country, believe it or not. And he is currently in Turkey, I believe. And Fabio is Italian and is in Milan. Beautiful. All right. Yeah, guys. So, let's hear your take on the election. What's it like to look at the U.S. election from an international lens?
So if I might first, it's just interesting. So I used to work during a couple of German elections, just like counting votes and like managing a polling station. And I think for many people, it's just surprising that this very thrilling process just takes very long. And I see this even like non-political family members and friends are just being confused why this takes long. So probably you guys can just tell us why and that the process is just very different. But I think it's just like a first observation that usually in many countries, like after 10 minutes, you basically know the results. So that's kind of interesting. And we still don't know it, right? Which is kind of exciting as a Politico just to kind of keep following it. It's a multi-day event.
Yeah, I'll give a quick one. The system here in the States is totally decentralized. So actually, in various counties, you do elect an election supervisor who's supposed to take care of elections for that particular county, and there are thousands of them. And then all of the final tallies are actually held by the Department of Elections of every state. So it's very decentralized in that aspect. And they do the old-fashioned, either vote counting machines or they're doing it by hand. It really depends. There's not a uniform way of doing it. I guess that's just the easiest way to respond. I don't know, Dave, if you have more.
Yeah, and different states and even different counties have different rules. So some of the states were allowed to basically process the ballots as they got them. So the reason why it's so slow is because it's mail-in ballots. And so you have to verify that it's real. And then they have to feed them through the machine, which is what you do on the day of when you actually vote. And so some counties and some states weren't allowed to start opening those envelopes until the day of the election. And so you can imagine these poor poll workers in some small county in Pennsylvania has 800,000 ballots to process. And then day of, they're like, okay, we can start opening ballots now. And yes, there's a room of, let's say, 50 people, but they're manually inspecting these ballots and then feeding them through the machine. And then if the machine says, we actually don't know what's going on with this one, well, then you have two scrutineers who look at it and decide, like, is it Democrat? Is it Republican? What was the intent of the voter? So it's all very, it's actually quite a intense process because of these mail-in ballots.
Just like one more question. Did I get it right that Nevada actually took a day off yesterday?
Well, they stopped counting at a certain point. Yeah, they said, okay, we'll just count these in the morning, which normally does not happen. I don't know what the deal is there.
Yeah, we were chatting about this earlier. Nevada just doesn't make any sense.
To be fair, though, I would just add for us Europeans, it's a bit easy to be to criticize how this can take so long. I'd just like to remind everyone that during the European elections start on a Thursday and end on Sunday, and we have the results between Monday and Tuesday. So far, if the election results come tomorrow, that would still be quicker than the amount of time we take in Europe. So before I see some people on Twitter grandstanding on this. We actually also take our time in Europe when the European election is taking place.
Yeah, makes sense. And Fabio, you are originally from Brazil, and I saw a lot of stuff about Brazil, and they count this stuff like super fast. Is that true? And what do you think of the election stuff that's coming out right now?
Yeah, so for me, from an international perspective, I see that especially at this time, it's impossible not to follow everything on Twitter. And I see that Italy, for example, has a very complicated electoral system and electoral law as well. I think very complex as it is in the United States. But it seems that everyone is professional about the United States election, so they don't understand their own electoral system, but they are right there in Twitter commenting and giving their opinion on the US election. I think the Brazilians are doing the same. The difference in Brazil is that they have everything electronic, so the counting of the votes is much faster. That's because we have 100% electronic voting. So maybe that's the difference. That's why we have like the result in maybe 3 or 4 hours after the polls closed. Yeah, but in Italy we have the same type of paper ballots that the U.S. use in most of the states.
That makes me think of one of the best tweets I've seen so far. Was a Russian individual who posted, "I'm from Russia. The wait on the election results is unacceptable. In Russia, we know the results well in advance of the election." Which was some much needed comedic relief in regards to all the craziness. We chatted, Yael and I chatted about how for international observers, and this includes Canada as well, it can seem weird on why Americans would vote for Trump. The general consensus in Europe is that they're very pro-Biden. Same thing in Canada. I was just wondering if you guys have any insights of what the local temperature is on Trump versus Biden, where you guys are at.
Yeah, I think it's a European consensus. I saw one map, which I think Italy is like the most Trump understanding country in Europe, if I remember it right. Yeah, I mean,
It was Poland.
Oh, Poland, okay.
Yeah.
Also Catholic, so there you go.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why we don't have these elections and ask international people. We ask Americans. So totally different response. That's another thing I wanted to bring attention to. Consumer Choice Center. Obviously, we love consumer choice, and there were some wins. I think everyone's focusing on the presidential stuff, but I wanted to talk about some of the wins. One of them that we were involved with was Proposition 22 in California. So this decouples the ability to become an independent contractor from California's AB5 law, the anti-contractor law. So it actually does give a pathway for rideshare drivers to be independent contractors and actually to also have health plans. So it was really interesting. That was a huge one. I don't know what that will mean if there is a Biden administration, because there's talk of a national AB5 law. But good things in California do happen every once in a while. So that was really cool to see. And then the other one I wanted to get your take on, if you guys have it, is we did see legalization of cannabis in Arizona, New Jersey, South Dakota, and Montana. And then we have medical cannabis in Mississippi, which a former editor of mine actually is a patient and was able to be a patient in another state, but was not able to in Mississippi, and now she will be able to. So any thoughts on cannabis now making the U.S. still way more liberal than most European countries on cannabis?
Yeah, I mean, that's really good news, right? It looks that one of the biggest losers of this election was the war on drugs. I also saw, I think, some other states decriminalized drugs, like Oregon. That is definitely good news for the criminal justice system and the usual victims of this. That's pretty exciting to see. I hope we get some of this over in Europe also soon. So because we always like to criticize the US for the criminal justice system, but then actually on state level, the US seems to be, at least in parts, much more advanced than most parts of Europe. And I saw that, was it South Dakota, which legalized recreational use of cannabis?
Yeah, it was like it was a two-step thing. It was they voted for medical, and then the next step is, okay, do you just want to go full recreational? So then it was like, yes, and both of them passed. So it goes to full recreational.
That's really exciting. And South Dakota voted for Trump, right? It's
Correct.
It's a red state. So that shows across party lines, voters still understand that the war on drugs has failed. And even if they vote Republican, many of them vote for the legalization of recreational cannabis. So that's exciting to see. So maybe, David, maybe soon the Americans will follow the Canadian lead and just go for national legalization.
Yeah, I mean, we're maybe at the tipping point now when it just becomes so widespread that all of the other states will realize, like, okay, this is ridiculous. Like, I'm pretty sure Idaho is now surrounded by legal states on both sides. So it's like, why? I mean, it's a country you can freely move about in. So hopefully we're at the tipping point where you just get federal legalization, or all of the states just realize, okay, yeah, our prohibition mentality is silly and let's give it up. So fingers crossed for that.
Yeah, and it's important. Arizona voted it down actually at the last election. So it's good to see that a lot of the voters changed their mind, or maybe there was a better campaign. I don't know. But they had previously been asked and it was a no. So that was good.
So I just cheated and looked at C-SPAN. So South Dakota actually voted nearly 62% for Trump. So it's like massive red pro-Trump state, but at the same time they legalized recreational cannabis. Would be interesting to see like age groups, if it like especially younger Republican voters voted for recreational cannabis. But that's definitely good news that consumers will have more choice and less likely to end up in jail for victimless crimes.
Yeah, that was a golden one. Another one that I liked. It's a non-binding vote, but this is in Washington State, and this is very much in David's wheelhouse, who's been on the plastic war north of the border. So they actually voted to repeal a tax that was put on plastic bags, take away plastic bags at the grocery store. So there was a tax originally that was on there, and then they voted to repeal that. It's actually a non-binding vote, so it's nothing that the legislator has to necessarily follow through with, but the pressure is there, which is interesting for, you know, a very green Washington state to have this, because people don't like to pay taxes on this stuff. And in a pandemic, when we're more reliant on plastic, people realize we shouldn't have to make people pay more.
Yeah, and my question to you guys, actually, we see that people tend to focus on the presidential election, but we see that in the House, we have the majority for Democrats. It seems that it's going to end that way. And also on the Senate, it seems that the Republicans are going to keep the majority of the seats. So what does influence the future for consumer policies and legislation in the U.S.?
Interesting. Yeah, definitely for things like, if you think of cannabis legalization, it is something that Joe Biden talked about and Kamala Harris. So it will be on the agenda for the House, and it'll be a very regenerated House. There'll be a lot of younger members, you know, a bit not as lethargic as before. So probably you'll have a lot of great ideas that come out, or some very bad ideas from a Democratic House. But really with the Republican Senate, you know, who knows if it's going to pass. I think for cannabis specifically, I think now with all of these states voting, that actually might have turned the tide enough. So we could see something there. The other big ticket items are things like healthcare, which will come up, but that I think is pretty much a non-starter for the Senate. But again, we'll see. I mean, there's the anti-contractor law is something that we really could see by probably mid next year. That would probably be proposed in the House, probably by these California legislators for some reason. And that could gain some steam. And, you know, you could actually see some Republicans look at that too. You know, the more, I would say, the nationalistic types who are more favorable of Trump. But yeah, those are the big things for now. David, I don't know if there's any others that I'm missing.
Yeah, the Republicans holding the Senate, which assuming they do, presents a very interesting. So if you're in favor of like political gridlock, this may be like the perfect situation because you will most likely have a Democrat president with a Republican Senate and a soft majority Democrat House with a relatively conservative Supreme Court. And so I think there's going to be a lot of back and forth over policy. The big thing is what does the Republican Party look like in terms of its embrace of populism moving forward? So do they hop on board with some of those more left-wing ideas of like contractor laws and things like that. I hope they don't. I hope the saner voices kind of prevail there. But generally speaking, I think that the setup, as if everything holds, is going to be decent for consumers from the perspective of it'll be a lot more unlikely that crazy regulations will be passed, or bans. And so, knock on wood, that's what happens. That could be good for folks who care about consumer choice.
I'm not
think
sure
what is
if we still have
interesting-
time for this, but I think it would be really interesting to see what your thoughts are, what this likely result of Republican Senate and a Democrat president would mean for immigration law.
That's a good question.
Yeah, I don't know. Reform on the Democrats. There wasn't. I don't know if there's any large scale reform from there, and nobody is apparently very satisfied with status quo immigration policy, which is actually pretty good when you compare it to the rest of the world. I don't know of too much momentum. I don't know if that would be one of the first things you try to do it. That might be something that you would try probably in year 3 to maybe get through, unless there's some kind of crisis. If something happens because of the pandemic in many countries in Latin America, for instance, some people are pushed out. That could be a big thing, but I'm not sure about that being a huge one in the beginning.
Yeah, and I think that the one, so from someone who is on the pro-immigration side of that debate, that may be one issue that kind of falls to the wayside, because if the results in the House have shown us everything, it's that, or have shown us anything, it's that the Democratic message, or the perception that the Democrats were moving really, really far to the left, I think scared away a lot of voters, and the Republicans were able to like call Democrats socialists and convince voters that that was the case. And so, if Joe's going to move back to the middle, which I hope that he would do as president, he may not actually take up immigration reform, because he doesn't want to be perceived as slipping into that progressive side of politics. Now, I would disagree with him if he does that, because I think that the U.S. system can continue to be open and fiscally responsible. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. But I think that we could see that issue kind of fall to the wayside, unfortunately. But yeah, that'll be a hot topic. I mean, it also depends on what the conservative and Republican approach is on that. Like, does Trump-style populism continue in the RNC moving forward, with very anti-immigrant rhetoric? I'm not sure. Or do we have more of like the return to normal, the Mitt Romneys, the Nikki Haley's? Then that was, I mean, that party, the old Republican Party was very much in favor of merit-based immigration. So it all depends as well on where the RNC goes.
Yeah, and it's also important to look at the states as somewhere where we tend to do a bit more, because that's where a lot of consumer regulations are passed. There weren't too many governorships that necessarily flipped, as far as I can tell. So it's going to be status quo. We still have to see what the state legislators provide. There might be something interesting there. Obviously, Florida will remain in the GOP, which, at least for our issues, particularly vaping and things, is actually very good, because they were able to block a flavor ban for flavored vaping products. So that was great. That was good to see.
Yep.
We'll see what happens in the other states. I think there's going to be a lot of more of these issues. That's why cannabis is certainly something to be hopeful about. Definitely ride sharing and the sharing economy. That's one thing to where the pandemic, we haven't talked about it much yet, but I think it's still gonna be really important, because like a lot of people have been out of work. A lot of people have not been able to work or to open their business. So a relief package, we haven't talked about it at all the last couple of weeks, but that'll have to be really important. And the states are going to be really necessary there too, because it can't be administered by the federal government. That'll be way too complex. If you think counting ballots is hard, just wait till trillions of dollars goes out the window. And that'll be important for figuring out what is the future of regulations on restaurants and alcohol and delivery and home sharing and flat sharing, all this stuff that might change. Maybe it'll improve. It's really hard to see right now, as soon as the pandemic can be in its last days. But our experience in Europe, where many of us are locked down right now, shows it probably ain't going away.
No.
Well,
And I think, oh, sorry. Yeah, you're saying, Bill?
Yeah, on that issue of lockdown, not related to stimulus, but the Trump has tried to frame the presidential decision over lockdown and or no lockdown, depending on who gets elected. Joe Biden has said that he doesn't want to lock anything down. Like, what is this? Like, depending on who becomes president, does that mean that there's going to be lockdown policies or not? Because right now in Europe, most countries are going back to what we had in March and April. This is very significant, actually, for many people, whether they can open their businesses or not. What do you think is going to happen?
So I know that was a strategy of the Trump campaign in terms of what they were highlighting in some of these states, and it was actually the reason why the Trump campaign argued that when Fox News called Arizona, that they got it wrong, because they were confident that based on the way lockdowns had impacted people in Arizona and his messaging in Arizona, that the assumption is that the mail-in votes are going to go for Biden. The Trump campaign was arguing, no, we don't think that's the case. We think you've called this too early. We think that the anti-lockdown voter is going to vote, like those are going to be dropped off in these drop boxes or on the day of. Those haven't been counted, and we think we win that demographic based on the messaging. So
I'm a lockdown voter. Count my vote.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and that's the thing. I was watching CNN yesterday, and there was no like the mishandling of COVID, right? That was supposed to be like, that should have been the nail in the coffin for the Trump campaign, and yet it didn't end up being that. Biden and Kamala Harris attempted over and over and over to try and highlight the mishandling of COVID as the reason why you should vote for Vice President Biden, but obviously it didn't stick. I mean, states that it should have turned the tide for Biden, whether it be Ohio or Georgia, which is close. I mean, he still could win Georgia because the count is very close, but you would think that would be a no-brainer. They failed to realize that the flip side of that is being perceived as pro-lockdown, and I think that that's one of the Trump messages that really stuck, because I mean, we've had these conversations with people all over the world. If you own a store and the government is saying that you can't open that store and it's illegal to open that store, and you think maybe that you can do things safely, it's hard to vote for a candidate for president who wants to basically shut your life down and stop you from being able to make mortgage payments and things like that. And so, yeah, I think the Democrats maybe misplayed their hand on COVID, because the flip side, as you mentioned, Bill, is the real impact of lockdowns. So we'll see whether that ends up being something that turns the tide. I know in Nevada, things are particularly close as we're recording. There were some murmurs that, again, the Trump campaign thinks that they will win Nevada because they think that they'll win Las Vegas, which is a city that needs people. They need tourists. And you have entertainers, performers, you have working class jobs, people working a blackjack table who are out of work because potential lockdowns. And then all of a sudden they realize, okay, well, my vote is going to go to the guy who wants to allow me to work again.
So what you're saying is we need to legalize gambling across the country so that we can have more Las Vegases.
There should be a Las Vegas in every state.
Oh, no doubt. And they do have it on Native American reservations and stuff.
Or riverboats if you go to Missouri.
In Europe, we had somebody actually call the election already. I'm not sure if you saw that. The Slovenian Prime Minister called the election for Trump. That was already yesterday. So quite in advance.
Well, he'll curry favor, or maybe that's like a Melania thing. He's like an old liberal, right? He was like part of sort of the or a lot of the Yugoslav stuff. He was like a big liberal in this big economic debate. But for the pandemic stuff, the only thing that I've seen that the Biden, let's say campaign, maybe administration, depending on how things go, the only thing they've talked about is like a mask mandate and like faster testing. nobody's got some. there's no golden policy. Also for like how with voting. I mean, Andrew Cuomo, governor of New York, probably some of the worst death rates in the entire country, and he's like just as popular as ever. So most of the time, it's not really tethered to that. It's a lot about media messaging and framing. And that's one thing I wanted to ask you guys about the media framing, because obviously the US, big private media sphere, but many European countries, most media, or I guess the media that most people watch, is usually mandated by or some kind of state media, whether it be BBC or any of the German news, something like that. How do you guys see kind of the media coverage in your countries versus, like, let's say the States?
Oh, so I mean, maybe I can start with my native home country, Germany, where you have mandated to pay a TV tax per household. They don't call it tax, but it's a tax because if you don't pay it, the government comes and takes it from you. I think we spend about 8 billion euros, which is roughly $10 billion a year on the massive state broadcasting. And it's even really hard for private media to compete because it's just so massively funded. Not sure of how many good German television shows you're aware of. I don't know any. So the quality of
I know a couple on Netflix, though.
Yes, but that's new. But so the quality of what's produced is also not good, right? Because they just get their funding anyways because people are forced to pay. So the quality is pretty bad. And most of the news reporting is done by government broadcasters. And it's not C-SPAN style where they basically just show you a hearing, but it's very opinionated. And about 80% of journalists working in the state-funded media are voting for left-wing parties. That's actually known. So it's extremely biased. And it's fine if a private news station is biased. I know that, for instance, CNN seems to favor the Democrats right now, but that's a private station, and viewers, consumers have the choice to watch Fox if they prefer that, right? Whereas if you have a state monopolist or de facto monopolist in media, and that one is actually biased, that's pretty nasty. I think something like a light version, something like C-SPAN, that's fine, just to kind of give people access to watch very long, boring congressional hearings. I think that's good. And that's not expensive, right? But our state broadcasters also spend hundreds of millions on getting the rights for the Olympic Games and showing soccer matches and these things. And they just outbid the private players because they just have like more or less unlimited money. So, and that should really not be the role of government to show you like trash Europop music and soccer matches in the evening.
Very polarized as well here in Italy. I think they are framing that as the good and the bad, and of course the bad being Trump. So yeah, very interesting to see how the media is playing. And I think they are following more or less how the media pictures everything in the US. I think it's a copy of how the media in the US perceive those candidates, and they use the same rhetoric and the same arguments. So pretty much the same here in Italy.
Yeah, when Americans supposedly envy Europeans from certain public services that we have, I always remind them that if you elect a certain administration in and you have a public broadcaster, and then they get to make the decisions on who gets appointed to run this public broadcaster, you eventually create this problem to begin with. Whether you favor conservatives and then you're worried that many people coming out of universities, especially in the journalism area, tend to be more left-wing, or whether you're a liberal and you're worried that a conservative president will just appoint a lot of directors to this public broadcasters that are right-wing. Ultimately, it's just a better model to have the choice between different broadcasters and not making people pay for a public one that will become the play ball of whatever political interest you have at that moment. I mean, if you're lucky in Europe, they're very boring. Which is still better than trying to frame the narrative on one political issue or the other.
Well, there's nothing worse, and this happens in Canada. There are a couple publicly funded comedy programs, and if the thought of government comedy makes your kind of skin crawl, they'll be on Twitter and they'll like try and make jokes, and then everyone will just dunk on them, like, "Ooh, government comedy, so funny." one thing that I've appreciated in watching this, because I've been watching this, I mean, a lot of people will be like, well, you live in Canada, so like, why do you really care? I mean, we're the country for whom it matters most, other than Americans, in terms of where this election goes. So I'm following things closely, and I've loved being able to go back and forth between Fox and CNN. One part because the commentary is different, but also because they focus on very different things. So CNN is all presidential race, all breaking down counties, all like who's winning, what the projections are, the mail-in votes, 2020's results versus 2016 results, where Fox is like flipping into congressional races and individual Senate races and interviewing people kind of on that local level. And so I mean, that for me is ideal. And yes, CNN is skewed left, and yes, Fox is skewed right. But you have the ability to toggle between the two, rather than trying to have some government funded news company trying to thread the needle to be perfectly nonpartisan, which, I mean, we all have our biases, so that's probably pretty difficult on an individual level, let alone an organizational level.
So to wrap it up in our final question, I'll give everybody a minute. How do you think this election actually maybe changes things or changes the dynamic in your own countries, either where you are, where you're from, and how we might actually have some positive things for things like consumer choice or trade or whatever it might be? Fred, you can start.
Yeah, I mean, it looks that if you get a gridlock, that actually the different political parties in the US have to start, or the two parties have to start working together, which might be actually an opportunity to reduce the polarization which is out there. And it's not just in the US, we have that here in the United Kingdom as well, that there is a massive polarization between the left and the right. And that just, you cannot attend any cocktail party or visit friends or neighbors without getting polarized. I mean, Brexit here was the big issue. Either you're pro-Brexit or you're a Remainer, and people stop talking to each other. And it's good at some point when people just realize, not everything is about politics, and we can still be friends. And I really hope the next 4 years will, especially with this apparently balanced outcome, will lead to, people sitting together again and just working together on solving problems.
I mean, depending on the outcome, we might have a shift in trade policy that might be better. I mean, right now we're still dealing with tariffs on all types of American goods and vice versa. And it would be great if there was a way to solve these trade issues, and maybe even revive some of the old ideas. I'm still a believer in TTIP. I think there's opportunities to do something similar, and then eventually have a trade agreement between the European Union and the United States, because we managed to conclude one with Canada. So why shouldn't we have one with the United States as well? And maybe even include food. So I mean, dream big. So no matter what the administration, I hope the next 4 years will have more commercial exchange between the two continents. Even though the political priorities might be different, there's still a great deal of products that I'd love to be able to shop here, and I'm pretty sure there's a lot of European products that the Americans would like to have access to as well. So, yeah, hopefully that's gonna happen.
I think honestly, beside trade with the European Union, nothing is going to change for the average Italian. So it's going to be the same. So the impact of the US elections in the Italians, so the day-to-day life, the average Joe, I don't think anything is going to change. I think it's more an ideological perspective that America contrabalances sometimes what the European Union and the Europeans, how they think about the presence and the whole of government. So that might change with the results of the US elections. But besides that, I don't think anything is going to impact our lives very much.
So you're saying nothing is going to change for the average Giuseppe in Italy then?
I was going to say that. You got me.
The average Mario.
Yeah.
We're going to still have pasta and pizza.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you guys for joining us on this week's episode of Consumer Choice Radio. We really appreciate it, and I know that you guys will be watching as the results continue to trickle in. So, yeah, stay safe out there.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. you.